Hello once again, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about a very, very niche bit of nitty-gritty. So we've been talking relatively large, big concepts for a while, and I want to take a bit of a back step and discuss something else, especially because this is something applies in a lot when it comes to grappling, which is why I have Bob here, but should still be present whenever you're using any type of sword. It just slightly alters being a little more linear. And what that is the idea of the default pressure that you exert toward your core. So what I'm talking about here is when we stand normally, there's not really a ton of stimulus going on. Obviously, we can function right here, can't function as well back here, etc. But once you put a side forward, this core now starts to get slightly different properties. Now what those properties are, regardless of which side is forward, is you have your stability on one side, you have your stability on the other diagonal, you have your base, which is where you can sink into. Now, in theory, you can, of course, be knocked into this base, but usually you'll find when you push into this, people are going to sink pretty well, even without a ton of training. And then finally, you have the area where you are weakest to be pulled into, i.e. forward, or as we call it, being dropped into the hole, but this is also the area where you can exert the most default force. And so what this is I want to talk about the idea of the intrinsic strength of your core, how to employ it, and how it'll slightly change depending upon how you're standing. So firstly, the intrinsic strength of your core. What that means is if I'm standing right foot forward and I'm going across my leg, this is not a terribly strong push for me. I cannot maintain a ton of pressure here without needing to commit more and more of my upper body. That's not necessarily very good for me. Versus if I'm lined up, this is actually quite strong. I can very easily keep the force that I've got or apply a decent amount of force without needing to really move a whole lot. It's okay for my shoulders to slightly come forward because they are supported by the rest of my shape. Just the same way that if I get pushed, I can sink into that back quadrant without much difficulty. Now, this can be used in a couple different ways. Number one, the time you use it the most is when it's going to be your striking, be it thrust, cut, what have you. The idea there being that when I line things up, I am exerting all of that force in strongly. Now what this is doing is not only is it lining it up for sake of power, but it's lining it up for sake of presence. Basically, once the shape is out here, that strength locks, as it were. Now, where this really matters the most and where people don't use it the most is in regards to defensive actions. So for this, let me actually grab a sword. I probably should grab one of these earlier. And for this, I'm going to use longsword for the moment. So basically the idea here is what most people do when they lose the ability of their core doing what they want to do is they will strike in and then they'll let this shape collapse. This could be for a variety of reasons, but generally it's just not thinking about what this can get you. Once this shape collapses, in order to exert force again, I will have to re-engage, which that's a lot harder to do than you think, especially if you have to re-engage to a more dramatic position. All of a sudden things are getting really thrown out of whack. Also, because this is now bent and not particularly strong, if I have to do any micro adjustments, this shape is going to become disconnected from what I'm doing, essentially like it's suspended. That's easy to manipulate both on my opponent's part and on my part when I don't want to. Versus, if I keep things strong, now if I move, it's tethered to whatever I'm touching. Even if I am touching nothing, it's tethered to me. It will turn on its own because this shape is locked and engaged. Now what I'm not doing here is I'm not going right, super strong, as fun as that is. What it is I just two extension, and then my arms remain engaged, exerting force into that area that I discussed. Now this should happen with pretty much all of your cuts, regardless of what they are, especially in regards to things like longsword, because we're never cutting over our lead leg. Even if we are doing something like a half cut, where we're going to the middle, this is not me going here, it's me going to the middle. Both my shoulders are square, meaning this shape still works because my core is going here right now. But in general, for most people, what will be happening is you'll be passing, etc. Your core will be going from one side to the other, regardless of what cut you do, and it's when you cut against that, all your power goes away. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, in general, once you start utilizing this, it's going to get you two things. Number one, and by utilizing this, I mean more just being aware of it. This does not require any active effort on my part. If anything, it's more of me choosing not to do more. Because it does take active effort, me thinking about doing something else to get myself to rebound. Instead, if I just think about, I'm going to cut, oh, I hit something, stay there, end of story. Or if I'm going to cut, I hit nothing, I'm still in the same level of engagement, just the engagement is pointing down, which is good because it leads into more follow-through. But again, what this is going to get you, it's going to get you the ability to create more reliable wedges. So if I need to get through a shape, this is your chappy because this is now supported from a lot more. Not just the one hand, but also my left hand. It is everything, well, right, because I'm being left-handed, but it is everything in this shape here strongly getting what I want to get without me needing to shove straight forward. It's coming out, aligned with my core, my tip gets to continue to do its job. Once that weak of my sword starts touching what it's dealing with, everything's going to go down to here, and I will be strong. And that shape can just continue on within. The big mistake a lot of people make thinking about wedges is that they think that they have to create them as you go in. That's not necessarily true. What you can do is you can start creating your wedge, and this can be from greater distance or even disconnected footwork. You start creating a wedge, and then that shape is carried in to hit target. You can think of this in the same vein as the idea of you extend, then step in your thrusts. Same sort of thing. With this sort of presence, it'll be very strong. The second thing that this will get you is when somebody cuts at you, and you just know that they're going to hit the guard, you've made the shape that their sword is about to land on, you don't need to do any more than that. I have noticed, especially in newer people, or even people who are more experienced but maybe aren't considering this, maybe don't have confidence in their guards, they will reinforce or brace or things along those lines that are just not necessary. If you are standing here and someone cuts into this line, technically if someone cuts into this line against this particular guard, I should not need to move. It will catch this that I have made, and it will not go through. Now, this last point in particular is better illustrated by a different sword. So let me start now talking about the idea of linearity. So, well, these will be fine. So in regards to linearity, this does alter slightly. Now, when I'm standing in a more linear position, be it my back-weighted rapier, my forward-weighted rapier, or my more even backsword, my core is still applying toward whatever I'm fighting. Even if I should do a relatively profiled lunge, all that is me turning my core still against what I'm wanting to do. So I'm lunging into quarta right now, meaning my core is lined up with this. I would not do that for any reason, because now my quarta is unsupported. Were I doing secunda, absolutely, I would bring that forward to now give my core more support. But I can still get away with not needing to put that much into it with practice. There's kind of more of a, when it comes to linearity, you can almost think of it more as there's a default middle line that is more often strong, and that is because we're always in the center. Versus when you are dealing with things that are more symmetrical, you are not always in the center, thus you need to be more aware of that and where you're applying your core. Not to mention, of course, passive steps versus lunges. Lunges create that shape that I was discussing. If I lunge, I don't have to worry, even if I lunge on a cut, I don't have to worry about, oh, and then I will apply my core behind it because by default, that's what's happening. I am making a shape, and then my legs are pushing that shape into target, thus creating wedge. But back to what I originally got this out for, let's talk about default position of your guards. So, possibly one of the strangest things to do, but is very, very good for you to learn how to do, is to receive thrusts or cuts or things along those lines on an extended guard if you are doing something thrust-oriented, or rapier, side sword, what have you. And alternatively, if you are doing something more like backsword, again receiving thrust, but also cuts against where your sword is without needing to move. So let's start with receiving thrust. So first off, thrust/cuts with a rapier. What I'm not talking about is I'm not talking, they're cutting at me. I'll stick my guard out here and I will be magically safe. That's not how that works. What it is the idea of once I'm out and engaged in distance, if someone is thrusting at me, I should not feel the need, once this is here, to push it any further. I do not need to parry from extension. If they go to a new line in relation to that extension, then yes, but that is a different scenario. It is the idea that once I am here, I'm pretty safe as long as I have the line that they are going at locked down. So at most, my parries from extension will just be usually quarta and secunda with slight elevation depending. The big mistake I see people make is that if they stay back here in response to their parries, but they overgo. They try to do this huge push when that's not needed. You'd be better off just extending. And that is not only how you learn how to do your counterattacks, but that's also how you are no longer parrying. You're just locking down the middle line. Now, along with this, however, is, of course, if they are cutting or things along those lines, don't you need to slightly reinforce? Yes, you usually want to, but that is just a small application, again, of angle, as opposed to me making a different shape. Some situations are, of course, exempt from that. Now, on the other flip side for linearity is the idea of just receiving a cut on the shape you've already made. So, especially in backsword, you're going to be making things, or military saber, you're going to be making what's known as the true cross. So, for example, right now my sword is more across from me than I would normally hold it. I'm usually going to be a bit more here, but all that does is just open up the center line and make it a bit more inviting for people to come at. Point being though, if I'm worried about just being more flat defensive, then yes, it is supposed to be a bit more across you. Now, the main weakness that I am currently showing is still my inside line. This is the outside guard, so it should be my inside line. But people will think that they can get through right here. If my guard is weak and timid, absolutely you can. But the difference is that I already have that state of engagement. The way I am holding my guard is not weak. If someone were to push against this, this is not going to relax on me. Furthermore, I can choose to apply a little bit of extra engagement from my arm, or alternatively a little bit of extra engagement from my tip. That will then create the wedge, the same thing that the extension did. This is really where that certainty of your posture is going to make the biggest difference. Of course, on the attack, it's a big part of it. I want to extend, then support that shape, extend, then support that shape, extend, then support that shape, regardless of what kind of footwork I'm using, passing, linear, whatever. But on the defense, it is that certainty of, once you take a position, that's getting me something. Right? Regardless of what it is, regardless of what system, regardless of what you're doing, they are giving us these positions for a reason. And if you can take them with that level of engagement, that core will start doing its job. Even the weakest core that I've ever had take lessons with me could do this. The reason being is that this is, while supported by the core, it's really more about your skeleton. Because the core by default, even if you are a weak person, can hold up the skeleton, otherwise you wouldn't be able to walk. If you can get the skeleton to do this, congratulations, you can hold a wedge. So the reason I wanted to go over that in detail is because it's not often talked about in such length, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not something that necessarily needs to usually be given that much emphasis. For most people, you just say, hold the guard this way, they hold the guard that way. But especially if you have gotten into the habit of worrying about other things, this may have slipped your mind, and you may be getting struck when you should not, or not be able to create the wedges that you used to be able to do so. And in general, I find that that has to do with this particular relationship. Now, in case you are curious as to, hey, okay, all right, sweet, what's a good way for me to practice this? This is where another main reason I brought Bob out here. The way I really learned this skill and thought about it was in grappling. The reason being is because when it comes to grappling, you're always worried about where your core is going. So what you can do very easily to practice this motion is find something, could be another person, could be an object, Bob's a person in my mind, put your hands on the object, not to the point that I'm leaning on him, just to the point that I am slightly giving him pressure. So if Bob were to suddenly be away from me, I am not falling forward, but I am giving him a little bit of pressure. And get used to the idea of moving around as you do that. If you have another person, then you can literally move around as they do that. Obviously, Bob is not necessarily the most footloose person, so it's not going to work out as well in this demonstration. But point is, get used to the idea of I'm slightly applying force in different positions as well, but none of this is me leaning on him. And what you can also do if you have a living partner is, as they are giving that light pressure, just scamper away real quick. If they fall forward, they're leaning on you. Either way though, that's going to be what I'm talking about for this particular episode of Nitty Gritty. Try it out, look in your guards, see if maybe you could do with a little bit of alignment, and odds are all of us could use a little bit of extra. But thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.